talk to you a little bit about a book that I wrote called Wish Fulfillment. And this book is coming out in the beginning of 2024, so if it excites you, maybe you can go to, I don't know, the Raven and pick it up. That would be cool. But I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about how I came about writing that book. And in particular, of course, you know, it's the spooky season, so I'm hopeful that everybody's going to be pretty jazzed to talk about witches. So, first question, who is the most iconic witch in recent years, maybe in the last 20 years or so? Shout it out. Oh, interesting. Sabrina. I love you. Yes, Wanda Maximoff. Yes. Oh, say it again. Carol. Okay. Yes, this is a different crowd than I'm used to. What else? Say it again. Baba Yaga. Yes, absolutely. How about in popular culture? How about one that started in books, went to film, then went to television?
White Witch from Narnia.
Okay, love that. Love all of those things. How about that? How about that? It's wild that nobody's mentioning Harry Potter, and of course there are lots of good reasons we're not. But I want to be clear, I'm not going to talk about Harry Potter for long, but it is often the first witch that people ask me about, or it used to be until, you know, bad things happen. So the notion of Harry Potter, I think, is at least useful as a starting point because my area of expertise is adaptation, and of course there's been plenty of different adaptations of Harry Potter. Here we see it in different forms from the same book itself. But also, of course, there's the theatrical version of, you know, the Cursed Child version. And this became interesting to my project in part because of the fact that when it went to the stage, the actor who played the role of Hermione was an actor of color. And all of a sudden, people started to lose their flippin' minds. So here we have a picture of the actor who played Hermione in the West End, Noma Delancey, and next to, of course, Emma Watson, who played it on the film. And, you know, and of course, here in the United States, when the play came to Broadway, the actor who played the role here was also a woman of color. And I only bring this up because part of what I talk about in this book is what it means to cast different actors as witches in these roles, right? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, as well as some things that have to do with design. Someone mentioned the Wicked Witch of the West. Of course, here we are in Kansas. We can't not at least take a moment to acknowledge this particular witch. And who was it who said the Wanda Maximoff? My beloved. We will talk a little bit about the Scarlet Witch as well. Okay? So, there's a quotation that has continued to inspire this book and the research around it. And it's from Pam Grossman. Do y'all know who she is? She's been called the Terry Gross of Witch Podcast. I'm not really sure what that means, but what I can tell you is that this quotation really resonates, right? Show me your witches and I'll show you your feelings about women. And that's part of why I started doing this work. But my question's a little bit different. I'm sorry, Pam, not about you this time. The question I have is, what wishes do we fulfill when we put witches on stage? And of course, in order to answer that, we also have to ask ourselves, who is we? At first, when I started doing this book, I thought about that in terms of the patriarchy, which was a weird thing to think about. We, patriarchy, me, not. But because that typically was the kind of wishes that were fulfilled with witches on stage, it was useful, yes? But honestly, as I continued to write the book, the witches that I was writing about told me, I know I sound crazy, but it is true, told me that in fact, the we should be about witches as well. So the book really looks at that question in terms of the wishes we fulfill for witches, as well as for the patriarchy when we put those characters on stage. So there are a couple of different modes of analysis that I use in this book. The first is adapturgy. So we sort of referenced that in the introduction. It's a neologism that I came up with. It was my first book. It basically is adaptation dramaturgy. It's the notion of what kind of research do we need to do when we're doing adaptations for the stage. So that, of course, course, is a pretty big part of what I'm writing about in this book, but if you want a quick and dirty little definition of adaptation, my favorite one comes from Linda Hutchian, and it is basically repetition without replication. It is, in fact, you know, if you think about it, whenever we see an adaptation, there is some kind of repetition, but hopefully not replicated entirely. And then the other thing that I really sort of emphasize in adapturgy is the notion of an embodied palimpsest. And in this room, I have a feeling everybody here does know what a palimpsest is, but sometimes people don't. So just in case, I have a little visual for you. It's basically back in the day when they used to have very little things to write on, and they would just write on over what they had already written before. And so you had layer upon layer upon layer of writing, and you could see the layers beneath. And so that notion of sort of being able to see the source beneath in the adaptation is really useful to me when I think about witches in terms of how they get adapted to the stage. But I'm also very, of course, influenced by intersectional feminism, and in particular, I'm looking at the construction of gender as it is sort of operating within the patriarchy, as well as the intersectional identities, of course, of race, sexuality, religion, ability, age, and class. In particular, one of the people who really influences me in terms of intersectional feminism is Sylvia Federici, and if you haven't read one of these two books and you're interested in witches, you absolutely must pick up at least Caliban and the Witch, if not Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women. So the book started with a question about why it is that we have an understanding of a ton of different kinds of theatrical types in the world, but we don't really talk about the witch as one of those. And what do I mean by theatrical types? Well, it's kind of obvious, but we have lots of different sort of stereotypes, archetypes, however you want to think about it on the stage. We think about it really simply in terms of heroes and villains, but we can also get a little bit more specific, you know, the tragic hero, right? ITJKU, don't get me started, I will continue. There's also the fun comic sidekick, right? Like there are all of these theatrical types that we see all the time, but once we start to drill down, they do become problematic, don't they? Because it's the way that we shorthand for race, it's the way we shorthand for gender, for sexuality, and all of these different kinds of ways of shorthanding these identities can be problematic. And eventually, we also have some interesting types that come around when we think about the ways that we represent different people of religious beliefs. And of course, the monsters and the freaks. And here, at the intersection of the religion and the monsters, is where we tend to find witches on the stage. And it's important to me that we include the religion piece of the puzzle because, you know, not all witches have a belief system that is tied to Wicca or witchcraft, to be sure. But, you know, there are, in fact, witches who do. So that was important to me as well. And so I started thinking about some examples of how on stage we have had in the past theatrical types that were a combination of a religious type, a cultural religious type, as well as a monster. Anybody think of some of those examples that are already perhaps in your mind, ways that we have represented different religious people? Okay. What else? Anyone? So I guess in particular, one of the things I started thinking about was the long and, you know, complicated history of how Jewish people have been represented on the stage. And this, in fact, becomes kind of important to the representation of witches because it turns out that there's a lot of similarities between the way that we tend to stereotype these two groups of people. And that really started to interest me in terms of how we began to see those types mirror each other on stage. And I started asking myself, well, what else might be the same there in terms of some of the things that we might learn when we look at them as theatrical types, looking at witches as theatrical types too. And of course, there's a historical reason for this. Those of you who are interested in the history part of it, it does come from the Malleus Maleficarum, which was the witches' The Hammer Against Witches. If you aren't familiar, I wasn't at first, it's intriguing to know that the Malleus Maleficarum was actually based on a previous book called The Hammer Against Jews. So there is an actual connectivity between these two things. And we can also see it in terms of the history of the witch's pointed hat. A lot of people believe that it started in the way that Jewish people were asked, forced, meant to wear the Judan hat, which looks a little bit like the canonical, typical, pointy witch's hat, right? There are other theories about that. If you're interested, please come talk to me. I will tell you. This led me to thinking about the fact that if we're going to talk about theatrical types, we can't talk about them without thinking about who embodies them. Who are the people who actually put them on the stage? And this word casting, as you might imagine, is actually kind of flexible. It is a performative word. That is to say that it does something. The word itself changes the status. Because you can cast a show, and when you cast a show, things change. But you can also, of course, cast a spell, right? And so, in particular, I was influenced by this scholar, Amy Cook, who says that there are 47 definitions in the Oxford English Dictionary that precede the theatrical meaning. So before we even get to casting a show, we have these meanings that have to do with activity about a forceful projection of one thing into another. And that really interested me in terms of what that might mean for witches in particular. But it also interested me, as we are thinking about identities, when we take the word cast and think about it in terms of caste, right? In terms of this sort of other meaning. And of course, this is not just my idea. This is a pretty important idea that Isabel Wilkerson and others have been talking about for some time. So, in order to look at these questions, what I wanted to do was to look at the casting, as we've just mentioned, but also to look at the design. So in particular, what I was interested in was costume design, as well as makeup design. So on the left here, we have the design for the 2018 production of the Scottish play at Chicago Shakespeare. And over here you can see the makeup design for the same actors in those roles. And this was a really interesting example because if you've ever seen a production of the Scottish play, you've probably seen all sorts of different kinds of representations of the three weird sisters, right? And this particular representation struck me as a little bit different than the ones I've seen before. So that's one of the case studies that we see. The makeup designer, just so that you know, for good measure, is Richard Jarvie from that particular production. So I kept looking at these things, and in particular, one of the things that also started to influence me was not just the designs themselves, but the process that these designers use to come up with the designs themselves. And so if you're not familiar, there's usually a lot of work behind the scenes before you get to the design. And here's an example of, the sort of early stages of designing a character called Griselda Bane. Is that not the best name for a witch character that you've ever heard? But in any case, this particular sort of montage or collage of ideas was really fascinating for me to explore in terms of what it then meant in the costume design itself. The palimpsest, if you will, of what this collage was still evident in the actual costume itself. So, ultimately, once I got to the point where I was writing the book, I know, you're like, get to it. I basically came to 6 different wishes that I zeroed in on that are fulfilled by witches in performance. And they are flight. The notion that witches fly is a really exciting thing. In particular, for my book, I look at The Wizard of Oz here. I look at Wicked, I look at The Wiz, I look at The Wiz Live, God help us all. No, I'm just kidding. It was good. It was all right. It was okay. It had problems. But in any case, start off by looking at flight. Also look at the sort of upcoming movie. Very excited to see this, whatever, is it 3 parts now, 2 parts for Wicked? Very exciting possibilities there. And this is the first time that we're going to have an actor playing the role of Elphaba who is a black woman. So that's exciting as well. The next wish that I was looking at is the wish of desire. And here we can think about the desire in terms of lust, but we can also think about it in terms of power. And here I'm looking at different kinds of adaptations of Medea. So I look in particular at a couple of different Latinx adaptations, Mojada and then Hungry Woman, but there are plenty to explore. The next one I sort of zeroed in on was prophecy, sort of divination, the way that we can tell the future, and I think you can probably guess who the witches are in this particular example. Anybody? You know we just talked about? Yeah, well done. The Weird Sisters themselves, but not just Shakespeare, because, you know, everybody does Shakespeare. There are other folks who have taken the Weird Sisters and put them into other contexts. So I talk about a couple of those in the book in particular. And from there, we go to possession. And here's where, for me, things get a little bit more interesting. Because the word possession, I think here in the United States in particular, but in the West in general, we tend to think about possession in a negative way, right? Like possession, like, oh no, someone's been possessed by the devil. We must exorcise that. No? Just me? Okay, cool. So what I wanted to do was to really explore the fact that in some cultures, the possession is the point. The trance is what people want. It's actually what they're trying to do. It's the way they do their witchcraft. But that word is also really flexible. And as I started thinking about these two witches in particular, Sycorax from The Tempest and Tituba from The Crucible, it really started to resonate for me in terms of the notion of possession, also the ways that human beings have been possessed by other human beings in our lifetime. And so, in particular here, I had an opportunity to talk to and work with Nicole Brooks, who is the mastermind behind this particular production that you see some images of here. This is the Obi Opera. It's an all-female a cappella production that takes Tituba's point of view and is basically a whole new sort of prequel to The Crucible. It's wonderful. I hope one day it'll come touring here. So after possession, I decided to look at the question of time. And here I'm really thinking about the sort of slippage of time that can happen with madness, because there's a lot of overlap between people who are called witches and those who might be called mad or insane or crazy, yeah? And so here in particular, I look at a play from 1836 called Witchcraft by Joanna Bailey, as well as a play called Witch by Jen Silverman. And finally, I look at shape-shifting, or shapes themselves. And of course, here, we can't resist, and we have to think about the way that a particular character really changed the shape of a town called Westview, and that would be on WandaVision, right? So the sort of series on Disney Plus, when it came out, was quite the phenomenon, if you can remember back then. And the hex that she put on Westview fascinated me, not only because it was a way of shifting shapes, right? But because it was also deeply problematic. As this particular commentator said, Tressie McMillan Popham, Wanda, she said, is a slave master, right? And this commentary really helped me think more complicatedly about Wanda Maximoff and all of the sort of reasons behind what she was doing. And a lot of people were talking about, well, maybe it's grief, it's stages of grief, and she's had all of these horrible things happen to her, which is true. But then I started thinking about that moment when she creates the vision, right? And she has this like back bend, and the emotion, the grief, the intensity of it comes out of her, and it starts to create this version of the vision. I'm sorry if this is a spoiler, you've had plenty of time to watch the series. Right? And why am I so interested in this? Well, first of all, it's pretty, it's cute, but more importantly, it actually looks a lot like the Arc de Circle. And the Arc de Circle, of course, is from Jean-Martin Charcot, right, from the late 19th century. This is the guy who really helped to popularize the idea of hysteria and the ways that women got categorized as being hysterical, right? And one thing in particular that the patients that he had would do is this particular arc to circle. And I don't know if you can see it, but for me, when I look at Wanda, that's what I see. So that's a little bit about what I do in that particular chapter, but of course I had to have a moment with my buddy Catherine Hahn here. Are y'all excited about the new series? Because it's coming. Who knows what it's going to be called? They keep changing the name. But basically Agatha's going to have her own series, and of course we should all take a minute to acknowledge how important Monica should have been in this play. So I'm going to wrap it up now and save some time for questions, but I hope that I got you a little bit excited about what is coming out in this book, and that maybe you have begun to think a little differently about witches already. Thank you.